Good afternoon. Thank you for attending our series, Women in Cognitive Science. Today our presenter is Dr. Kathleen Slaney, and she's for the Department of Psychology of SFU. She will be talking on the ambiguity of concept use in psychology. By the way, my name is Rada Trnavak, and I'm currently teaching at the Cognitive Science program. I would also like to point out that next time our next presenter is Dr. Irani Gabora on November 16th, and her topic is on creativity. Now I'll pass on to Mark.
Great. So it's my pleasure to introduce Kate Slaney as our speaker today. Kate joined the psychology department in 2006 when she was a graduate student who was so brilliant we could not possibly let her leave. And so we didn't, and she joined the department ever since. Has been an energetic and creative and wonderful in addition to the faculty, and is one of my dear friends in psychology, even though we disagree on probably virtually everything. And in 2011 won a very prestigious prize for early contributions to theoretical and philosophical psychology. And her talk today is on the concept and whether it's useful to use the concept. So take it away, Kate.
Thanks, Mark. And I'd also like to thank Steve and to Shamina, and I don't think either are here, but for inviting me to do this talk, and actually to Mark again for suggesting it in the first place. Now, today's presentation is oriented actually around a paper co-authored by Tim Racine that appeared in the Journal of Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology earlier this year as a target piece with commentaries from 4 individuals: Edward Moschery, Catherine Nielsen, Mark Bickert, and Wolf Michael Roth. Now, due to time constraints, I'm not going to cover all of the ground that we cover in the paper, and I probably won't say anything about the commentaries, although perhaps if any of you have read them and you have questions about it, we can talk a little bit about it in the question period. My aim really today is to present in pretty broad brushstrokes the major points that we raise in the article and hopefully invite some questions and comments from you so we can have some interesting conversations about the concept and its uses in psychology. So I'd just like to begin with a couple of quotations that are particularly relevant to the topic that we address in the paper. The first by William James and the second by Gottlob Frege. Now, James writes, "The function by which we thus satisfy a numerically distinct and permanent subject of discourse is called conception, but the thoughts which are its vehicles are called concepts. But the word concept is often used as if it stood for the object of discourse itself, and this looseness feeds such evasiveness that we shall avoid the use of the expression concept altogether and speak of conceiving states of mind or something similar instead." And Frege writes, "The word concept is used in various ways. Its sense is sometimes psychological, sometimes logical, and sometimes perhaps a confused mixture of both." Now, these 2 quotations really capture the primary theme of the talk and of the presentation today, and that's that the concept is vague and it's used in various ways. Now, I'd like to just say a little bit about the motivation for writing this paper in the first place. There were really 2 impetuses, if impetuses are plural, or if an impetus can be plural. The first occurred a number of years ago when I attended a talk of Mark Blair's, actually, presenting findings from some of his empirical investigations on various aspects of attention on categorization. And during his talk, he made frequent mention of concepts. And at the time, my understanding of concepts really didn't go much beyond the ordinary layperson's understanding, outside of making references to concepts and to the grammars of concepts in conceptual analyses I had conducted up to that point. But something about the way that Mark was using it didn't seem to overlap completely with the sense that I was assuming, and so I suspected that he was using a technical definition of the term. And when I asked him in what sense he was using the expression, he seemed a little bit surprised and responded something to the effect of, a concept, a category, and he pointed to his head. And this was the first time that I realized that maybe I didn't share the same assumptions about the ontology of concepts as many of my colleagues. The second impetus occurred shortly thereafter, when in 2007, in a comment on a paper written by Mike Marin and me on the uses of analogy and metaphor in neuroscience, Justin Sitzma claimed that our take on representation was fallacious and that concepts do not necessarily have grammars. And whether or not one believes that they do depends actually on the theory of concepts one adopts. So having never taken a cognitive psychology class actually ever, at any point in my education, I have to admit, really somewhat embarrassingly, that I was quite perplexed by these uses. I had never heard concept used in these ways, nor did I realize that there were full-blown theories dedicated to discovering what concepts are. And so it was at this point that I realized that psychologists may not be employing the term concept in the same way, and that I would need to explore just how it was used and if it was used variously, hopefully in order to spare myself any more embarrassing moments. So that concept paper sat on my to-do list for quite a long time. And then a couple of years ago, my colleague and good friend Tim Racine asked me if I had ever thought about writing a paper on the uses of concept in psychology, to which I responded, well, actually, funnily enough, I have. And he had been doing some work examining the way the term is used in developmental research. So Tim and Mark and I sat down and we met a couple of times to talk about these different uses of concept, and we even played around with the idea of writing something of a dialogue contrasting different accounts. But it became clear fairly quickly that we weren't going to get very far on such an endeavor until I really got straight what my views on concept were. So I thought at this point that I would back off and do a little bit of legwork to determine just really what my thoughts are on the concept. And so the first step really was to do this sort of inquiry into the uses of concept which Tim and I ended up working on together, and this would result in the paper, the major findings of which I'll present today. Okay, now it seemed to me that a reasonable starting point would be to explore the various theories of concepts that had been offered up over the past few centuries, and having not known anything about them, this is where I began the quest. I'm going to presume that most of you will know something about these theories, about these basic accounts, so I'm really just going to list the major players and just very, very briefly describe each. In the paper, we go into a little bit more detail about them, and we contrast them against one another. Now, first of all, the classical theory, or classical theories, the basic gist of the classical view of concepts is that concepts have a definitional structure. That is, they can be defined in terms of singly necessary or jointly sufficient features. So those objects having those properties are instances of the concept, and those that do not are not. Neoclassical theories, like the classical view, assume that concepts have a definitional structure. However, unlike classical theories, they relax the sufficiency conditions and assume that instead concepts are specified only in terms of necessary conditions, although some neoclassical views assume some degree of sufficiency also. The prototype theory is perhaps the first broad-based, formalized theory of concept acquisition and possession to grow up in psychology as opposed to in philosophy and linguistics. And it comes in two basic varieties. The probabilistic or statistical view assumes that concepts are defined in terms of differentially weighted features, some of which are thus more prototypical than others. So for example, something is more likely to be classified as a dog if it fetches, barks, wags its tail, than because it has 2 eyes, 2 ears, 4 legs, and so on. The second variety of the prototype theory is the exemplar view, according to which concepts are defined in terms of individual category instances which best represent the category as a whole. So a German Shepherd is a more prototypical dog than is a Chihuahua, and so on. Now, like the prototype theory, the theory of concepts has gained a fair bit of popularity within psychology. Now, theory theorists draw an analogy between scientific theories and the mental theories an individual has regarding the surrounding world. So just as theoretical terms stand in relation to the to the scientific theories rather in which they are embedded, so do concepts stand in specific relations to the particular folk theories that individuals hold about their experiences of the world. concepts from this perspective are either mental theories themselves or are constituents of mental theories, and they're individuated by the particular roles they play. Now, an altogether different view of concepts is conceptual atomism, also known as informational atomism, among other things. Assumes rather that almost all lexical concepts are unstructured symbols that carry information about aspects of the environment. Okay, so in the next section of the paper, we consider these major theories of concepts in terms of the various ontologies that they imply. And we try to summarize these in terms of three general perspectives on the ontology of concepts. The first two have been contrasted recently in the philosophical literature, and the third is one that we offer up. So the first two basically are, first, the idea that concepts are best conceived as abstract objects, and secondly, or alternatively, that concepts are mental representations. And in philosophy, there's been some debate as to which one is correct, and people have come up with compatibilist views, but generally they're bifurcated in this way. The third so-called ontology of concepts we describe contrasts actually with both of these accounts, and instead it represents a composite of language-based construals of concepts. And I'll just say a little bit about each of those three. So from the perspective of the first general ontology, concepts are taken to be abstract entities. Specifically, concepts are thought of as constituents of propositions. And because propositions are abstract, so too must concepts be abstract. And this further implies that concepts are independent of minds. This is often referred to as the semantic view of concepts, and it stems largely from Frege's work, distinguishing sense from reference. In particular, his attention to the mode of presentation problem. And the mode of presentation problem is essentially that two co-referring expressions, that is, two expressions that can refer to the same thing, the same object, can have quite different cognitive, so-called cognitive content. So Mark Twain and Samuel Clemens they're concepts that refer to the same individual in this case, but they can mean quite different things. 2 + 3 and the square root of 5, the morning star and the evening star are other examples, and there are many. Now, Frege's explanation was that all expressions have both a sense, or a mode of presentation, and a reference, that to which they refer. The former, and not the latter, is what determines the cognitive content of an expression, according to Frege. Now, from this perspective, concepts are individuated by their senses, and to possess a concept is to grasp its sense. A second major ontology of concepts is, which is implicitly or explicitly presumed in different theories of concepts, supposes that concepts are mental entities of one sort or another, but mental entities with a semantic content. So this view of the ontology of concepts is clearly wedded in important ways to the representational theory of mind, which very generally speaking postulates the existence of mental intermediaries between objects experienced and experiencing agents, these intermediaries being some sort of symbolic representation of that which is experienced. Now, the exact nature of the symbolic representation varies from theory to theory. However, despite their differences, all RTM informed or inspired conceptualizations of the ontology of concepts are unified by the notions that mental representations have some sort of causal, mediational, or causal functional role in propositional attitudes such as beliefs and desires, and that these representations exist in the mind, or in some cases brain, of the being who is said to possess the concept. So as such, they are mind or brain dependent. Now, from this perspective, to possess a concept is to have a mental representation. This ontology of concepts, really more than the semantic view, is typically assumed, again, implicitly, if not explicitly, in most concept theorists working within psychology. Now, the third perspective on the ontology of concepts that we describe in our paper actually doesn't take an ontological stance with respect to concepts at all, or at least not in the same way that the others may be said to. This perspective offers a characterization of concepts in terms of an ordinary language analysis, along the lines of Wittgenstein's later work and similar contemporary treatments. Now, this perspective denies that concepts are either abstract entities or mental particulars. Instead, concepts are taken to be the elements of a language, or linguistic entities, if you'll permit the metaphor, that feature prominently in humans' understandings of the world and their ability to express these understandings. So specifically, we agree with Peter Hacker and others that concepts are abstractions of the uses of words. So for example, the concept dog is expressed by the words dog, shin, inu in English, French, and Japanese respectively. The words differ, but they express the same concept. The same concept in different natural languages will admit of the same general logical space in a network of words, what Hacker calls the same combinatorial possibilities and impossibilities with other concepts. To extend the example further, the words dog and puppy in English are logically related to one another and are used in roughly the same way as the words shen and shio and inu and koinu in French and Japanese respectively. Likewise, red, rouge, and aka are expressions of the same concept in 3 different languages. Moreover, the linguistic view understands concepts as being internally, that is logically, related to their modes of expression. So one cannot, for example, parse the concept red from the words that express it, red, aka, rouge, and so on. And one can't know what red means, but not know what the concept red means, and vice versa. So conceived in this way, analyzing a concept involves analyzing the uses of a word. And to possess a concept is to know what the term or the expression of the concept means. And this entails being able to use it in accordance with the conventions within which it is used, and or to explain these conventions of use to another. So in other words, one can be said to possess a given concept when one has mastered the rule-governed use of the word or words that express that concept. Now, to have grasped the concept dog, for example, is to use the word dog or its counterpart in another language correctly, which is to have mastered the so-called logical articulations of the concept. That is, to apply it to dogs or dog things, to demonstrate an understanding that dogs are animals and not plants, to know that puppies are baby dogs, and so on. So concepts can be individuated then by the different roles they play, the different uses they have in a language. And from this perspective, concept possession is a complex activity or set of interrelated activities that includes, but isn't limited to, mere recognitional or discriminatory abilities. So for instance, to say that somebody possesses the concept round is not to say only that they can recognize round things or they can discriminate round things from things of a different shape, say square things, but also that they understand that round is a shape and not a color, that the property of roundness exists in degree, and that something cannot be said to be at the same time perfectly round and perfectly square, and so on. Now, I should note, just because people will often jump on this, and I'll say more about it maybe during questions, because concept possession is a complex capacity, mastery of concepts is not an all or none thing. We know this, but rather it tends to be graded over the course of learning a language. So I just want to issue that caveat, because when we say things like possessing a concept is using it in accordance with a rule-guided practice, it sounds more rigid than we actually intend it to. Okay, in the next section of the paper, we highlight how various theories of concepts may be contrasted in terms of whether or not they provide both an ontological and epistemological account of concepts, or whether they emphasize primarily one over the other. And we raise the issue because whereas concept theorists within philosophy, until recently anyway, have tended to emphasize the ontology and analysis of concepts in their theories, psychologists have tended to be more inclined towards inquiries into the nature of concept acquisition and possession and categorization and inference, really those pertaining more to the epistemology of concepts. Now, a rough distinction, really, and it is very rough and superficial, is that ontological accounts are meant to furnish a theory as to the origin and nature of concepts, and epistemological accounts are chiefly concerned with explaining how it is that people come to acquire concepts in the first place. Now, although psychologists might be tempted to think that the latter is the only important question, or the only psychologically interesting question, really, there is, in fact, a fairly widespread tendency in psychology to conflate epistemological and ontological questions. And we believe that at least some of the work on concepts in psychology falls prey to this conflation. And we attempt to demonstrate this in our description of the uses of concepts in psychology in the paper. I won't really say much more about that now, though. In this section of the paper, we describe what we refer to as the received view of concepts that appears to inform most, if not all, empirical programs of concept research in psychology. Now, this received view, we argue, is heavily informed by an RTM conception of the ontology of concepts, even though many psychologists really weigh epistemological issues much more heavily than ontological ones, and many will actually never take an explicit stand on the ontology of concepts per se. They assume an RTM conception. We characterize the received view of concepts in terms of the following core tenets. So first, concepts are mental particulars. 2, concepts are representations of substances, events, and relations that occur or potentially occur in the external, that is, the non-mental world. 3, taking these two together, concepts are mental representations. 4, concepts play a causal mediational role between a substance, event, relation, and some cognitive ability of the bearer of the concept. 5, concepts contain knowledge or information about the substances, events, and so on they represent. 6, concepts are tied in important ways to particular cognitive abilities to the cognitive abilities of categorization and induction. And 7, concepts share important relationships with language, but are not, strictly speaking, dependent on language. And so I'll just elaborate quickly on these and draw some examples from the literature. So first, concepts are seen as being mental particulars. So really, there seems to be a fairly general consensus among concept researchers that they are mental entities of one sort or another. They're described as or characterized as mental contents, as the constituents, elements, building blocks, or organizers of thought, as psychological structures, mentally possessed ideas, and so on. More recent characterizations, which are consistent with a growing emphasis on neurophysiological theories of psychological processes, might actually be inclined to go even one step further and describe mental states or equate mental states with brain states and characterize concepts thus as neural entities themselves or as being causally dependent on such neural substrates. Either way, whether the provenance of the mind or the brain, concepts are generally taken to refer to things in the head. Now, a second general feature of the received view is that concepts are generally taken to fulfill a representational role. They are seen to be cognitive placeholders, if you will, in that they symbolize to the bearer the objects, events, and relations that enable him or her to recognize that a given thing is a thing of a certain kind, that it differs from other kinds of things and is related to other things in particular ways, and so on. So by representing the legion features of reality we experience, concepts allow us to function and make sense of the world. Taken together, points 1 and 2 imply a third feature of the received view, and that is that concepts are mental entities of some sort whose role is to represent various features of the world and thus endow the bearer of concepts with an array of cognitive abilities, most notably the ability to categorize and to make inferences about and to adopt propositional attitudes towards objects, events, and relations that are encountered in experience. However, the specifics with regard to how concepts as mental representations are characterized varies across theories, depending at least in part on the particular domain of concepts that is the foci of study. Now, for most contemporary concept researchers, it's insufficient to think of concepts as mere representations of objects and properties in the external world. Rather, they're taken to play some sort of causal mediational role with respect to cognitive competences. However, there's no real consistency among concept researchers as to the specific ontology these causal mediational entities the specific ontology of these causal mediational entities, or the specific nature of the causal mediational relationship, sort of which direction it goes in, or whether it has a direction. So just to pull some characterizations from the literature, concepts are described as playing a central causal role in mediating inferential transitions and reasoning processes. Concepts satisfy whatever ontological conditions have to be met by things that function as mental causes and effects. I think that was Fodor. Concepts have both physical causal, presumably neurological properties, and semantic properties. Now, fifth feature of the received view concerns the content of concepts. So concepts are seen to contain or be the conduits of knowledge. They are described as bodies of knowledge stored in long-term memory, as containing knowledge, as representing knowledge, as being knowledge rich or knowledge poor, and so on. Now, with regard to concepts and categories, or concept and category being equivalent, although few philosophers would likely equate concepts and categories, within psychology, the two have shared a much closer relationship, and many concept researchers treat them as being essentially equivalent. When they are distinguished, typically a category is described as a set of objects, events, relations, or so on, grouped according to some common property or set of properties, and then the corresponding concept is the mental representation of the category. Now, finally, although they are thought to share particular relations with natural language words and expressions and to play a very important role in language and communication, concepts, or at least some subset of primitive concepts, are generally treated as being a priori and thus independent of language. In many cases, words and expressions are characterized as getting their meanings via mapping them onto particular conceptual structures. So from this perspective, natural language expressions become predictably associated with first simple and then progressively more and more complex concepts which are possessed by the individual. So the relationship between concepts and natural language words and expressions is, from this perspective, conceptualized as being an external rather than an internal or logical one. And the major implication of this is that concepts are, at least ontologically speaking, language independent. And again, just to draw some examples, concepts are characterized in the following ways. Word meanings are psychologically represented by mapping words onto conceptual structures. Words of a language make contact with specific concepts. And word learning is largely a matter of associating verbal labels to pre-existing concepts. Now, in the final section of the paper, we reintroduce the linguistic construal of concepts, and then we examine the core tenets that we've identified in light of this alternative account. Now, recall that the basic premise of the linguistic construal is that concepts are components of a language, that they feature in the uses of words and expressions and other symbols that are meaningfully employed for a wide range of ends, including but not limited to communication. Now, before summarizing our claims, I just want to say or be clear about a couple of things that we are not claiming. We're not claiming a lot of things, but we're not claiming, first, that there haven't been truly important and interesting empirical findings concerning concept acquisition, perceptual organization and discrimination, categorization and inference, and a myriad of other aspects of our conceptual systems. We're not claiming that something not represented by a concept has no ontology. We're not claiming that there are only a fixed set of uses or a rigid set of rules guiding the use for a given word or expression. And we're not claiming that it's untrue that the way the world is or the way our perceptual and conceptual systems are, the constraints on how we may interact with the external world and so on, constrain a language. In fact, quite to the contrary, and so constrain its concepts. Really, our aim is to examine the core tenets of this received view, assuming we have characterized these fairly, from the vantage point of what we already understand about the concept, that is, in terms of how concept is used in ordinary language. And so I'll just very briefly go through each of the tenets that we've identified as comprising the received view and respond from the perspective of the linguistic construal. Okay, so there is a completely ordinary sense in which a given concept can be considered mentally represented. For example, a person is able to bring to mind an instance of a concept when asked. So if I say dog, you might think golden retriever, or if I say cup, you might think of your dirty cup sitting on your desk, half full of coffee. However, it's not clear in contemporary scientific treatments of concepts as mental representations how they are representations or mental for that matter. So the concept of representation itself is, like most concepts, complex, and many different things can be said to be a representation. However, all representations share certain features. First, representations are representations of something which is logically antecedent to the representation. Second, therefore, something cannot be a representation of itself. The Eiffel Tower cannot represent the Eiffel Tower. And third, representations and systems of representations are conventional. That is, they're rule-governed, and thus they can only be meaningfully employed in the context of a rule-governed activity and by creatures that have the capacity to understand and use these rules. Now, I just want to issue another caveat. By rule here, you can think of standard or standard of correctness or object of comparison, and less in terms of rigid and stipulative rules. Now, given this ordinary sense of representation, it's not clear how a mental representation actually represents, how it functions as a stand-in for something else, and for whom it does so if it's confined to the private domain of the mental. Mental representations appear to differ from other sorts of representations, signs, symbols, maps, and so on, but it's not clear, or it's not made clear by concept researchers how they are different, and maybe importantly, how they are similar. Now, from the linguistic construal, because concepts are taken to be components of a language, which is a complex social practice, it would be wrong to think of them as having causal or mediative powers. Although, of course, certain concepts are invoked in order to speak about the actual or potential causes of something, or to identify a cause, or to test a causal hypothesis, and so on, they do not themselves enter into causal relations or nomic relations. The relations into which concepts enter are normative ones. As for concepts containing or carrying knowledge, if one is invoking the ordinary of concept, the ordinary sense rather of concept, then this notion really fails to cohere. Knowledge and information, unless we mean something else than we typically do, are expressible in concepts, and so they presuppose concepts. Therefore, claims about concepts containing knowledge and information cannot but lead to an infinite regress. However, it's possible and potentially a possible and potentially reasonable exception is if the senses of knowledge and of information and like concepts are actually technical homonyms for the ordinary senses. So we don't mean the same thing, we mean something different, and here's what it is. However, although a number of concept theorists, for example, Mashri, claim to provide such technical definitions of knowledge in his case, in the end, these too appear to be dependent on the ordinary senses, and so they fall prey to similar conceptual difficulties. And so in the absence of clear provisos as to the special senses in which knowledge and information are being used, we can only assume the ordinary senses which, as we know, do not lend themselves very well to the notion that concepts could carry them. Knowledge and information, that is. Okay, as to whether or not concepts and categories are the same thing, really whether a given concept is considered to denote a category or class will depend on the context, and really will come down to whether or not it's valuable to think of a concept in that way or useful. However, there are many instances in which concept is not used to denote a category of objects or substances, events, and so on. So from the perspective of the linguistic construal, category concepts, which themselves make up a quite heterogeneous class, constitute one but several types, different types of concepts. And those types will in many contexts be related most closely to the uses those concepts serve up in a language. Now finally, whether concepts are related to but independent of language. Concepts are represented by words and expressions in a language, but also in some cases by pictures or non-linguistic signs and symbols. However, from the linguistic construal of concepts, this doesn't imply that concepts are merely reliably associated with particular words. Rather, concepts and their modes of expression, including non-linguistic modes, are taken to be internally or logically related to their expressions. So to treat concepts as language-independent entities in the head, which are merely correlated with words, is to assume an external relationship between concepts and their expressions. But for this to be the case, there must be some means of independently identifying a concept from its modes of expression. And so far, no one seems to be able to do this. So from this perspective, concepts are not merely expressible in a language, but they're bound up in a language in a way that to attempt to cleave the notion of a concept from its place in a language is to use the concept in a very constrained and restricted way, and one that may not resonate well with the ordinary uses. So just to wrap up, in the paper we sketch the historical and philosophical contours in brief, very brief, of the concept, and we contrast two mostly incompatible ways of understanding the ontology and epistemology of psychological concepts. And if we were to boil down the message, the take-home message, it would be this. One, concept acquisition research presupposes definitional and therefore ontological issues that must be appropriately addressed beforehand for such epistemological questions to have any clear meaning. And two, therefore, attempting to determine empirically the ontology of a concept is misguided because so-called ontological questions actually really only appear to be ontological questions because of their form. What is a concept? Really, they're definitional in nature. And three, concept researchers are oftentimes using concept in one or more of its ordinary senses, and so are not discovering anything further about the ontology of concepts, although they may be discovering interesting, and often are discovering interesting things about concepts. Rather, they're placing an already familiar notion, concept, within an RTM framework, with the result that the concept is then taken to denote processes that explain how it is that publicly shared concepts are acquired. So I think I will leave it there and now pass it over to you for any questions or comments that you might have. I welcome them. Oh no. Turned you off.
People have class. So.
Yeah.
My answer was one, and as I put it in an email message, I was writing a chapter on concepts earlier this year, and I commented to somebody that I had nothing to draw from psychology on this subject, even though the rest of the book talks about a lot of psychological topics, and I just was not prepared to do an analysis of literature, or conceptual analysis of concepts, but when I read your paper, or listened to your paper last week, you really did a great job saying, yeah, that's what's wrong with psychology with respect to concepts. Not that I agree with all the details, but I think the gist of what you're saying is spot on. One of the kind of concerns I have, and I start with a question, is I'm not sure how far you want to take your mental concept. In other words, are you assuming that those of us, which I would take to be just about everybody in cognitive science, who assume that the mind works with representation, that we're kind of at fault here because concepts are not explicit, they're not mental particulars.
Mm-hmm.
So how far do you want to go? Do you become a non-mental representationalist, or would you accept that information processing machines are able to be described as having concepts, and these information processing machines deal with representations, though not necessarily having these particulars to represent the concept?
Right. Well, a couple of responses, I suppose, to your question. First, I wouldn't say that we have that very well figured out ourselves, because we're not really offering up an alternative theory. So it's more a reaction to what's there as opposed to here's something else. A second response would be that the representational theory, and you actually mentioned in an email that you didn't think it was a theory as much as a description. I would agree with that. The representational theory of mind is a description, I think, of how we see things. And in some cases, I think it can be very useful. Whether or not the representational theory of mind as an ontology of concepts is useful, I think is the question that we kind of strike at, if that answers your question. But I don't think we're willing to throw away the representational theory of mind all told and say it has nothing to offer. But it may not tell us very much about what a concept is.
Nor need it.
Right, nor need it.
It's not relevant.
Right. Yes?
Some, I guess, simple-minded question about your own positive view of the language. So, what about all the concepts we evidently have for which we have no lexemes? I don't know languages where we know about lexemes.
Okay.
What about children who, for one reason or another, do not develop language or are not capable of, because of, say, congenital deafness, taking more conventional language, nonetheless develop rudimentary language systems of their own? They think propositional thoughts, as they're not coded initial concepts as constituents.
Right. They certainly behave in ways that would lead us to make those inferences, right? Yeah, I guess I would say that first that concept, to speak of the mastery of concepts as we do, is kind of taking us to the end point, right? To have mastered a concept, yada, yada, yada. Of course, we accept that concept acquisition or concept possession is a very complex activity, and it evolves over time within a practice of language. To say that a being that cannot speak, cannot tell us the meaning of a concept or show us in other ways that he or she understands, I suppose would be using concept in a fairly limited way. That's what I would say. Can they conceptualize? I think yes, they can conceptualize. What that means in the absence of language is tricky. It's complicated. But to say that they have concepts in the way that you can say that a competent language user has concepts, I think is confusing things. I think there are different things going on there.
But isn't that just to say, well, there's lexical concepts and there's perceptual concepts?
I suppose, and that's largely a matter of taste and of usefulness as to whether or not people working in a scientific domain want to make those distinctions. I guess the question really is, are they useful distinctions to make? Do they help us? And if they help us, then fine. It's just sometimes they're radically underspecified and claim to do things that I think they don't do in the end. Yeah. Yes, Don.
Well, if one thinks of psychology as being about the prediction of behavior, then to what end are concepts useful in the prediction of behavior? And I'm thinking of a purely behaviorist kind of animal learner person who's training a chimpanzee to do one thing or another, or your dog or whatever, and the behaviors are quite predictable. But one, of course, in that situation may not presume that there's a mental representation, but they certainly act as if there is. And obviously younger humans act as if there is. So I'm just asking, I guess, if you were just about prediction of behavior, would the concept be useful to you?
I guess I would first ask what you mean by the concept, because I think the standard use, no, I don't think it would be very useful. I don't think you need it. You could predict without it. But my understanding of concepts, I mean, there's sort of a, we'd have to have some understanding of concepts to even be having the conversation about prediction in the first place. That's kind of coming at it from a high level. But is there the need for a notion of a psychological concept? No, I don't think so. But those aren't the grounds on which we make our arguments.
No, I understand.
They're often misinterpreted, I think. An ordinary language philosophy is often interpreted as advocating a behaviorist perspective. But certainly that would be what some people would say. They're not useful because they don't add anything.
Psychology has kind of come to this very late.
Yeah.
If you look at the research that Mark might be talking about, or his predecessors and so on, I mean, really it was only sort of the steps beyond pure behaviorism that allowed that research to even get done.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
People couldn't conceive of, psychologists couldn't conceive of doing work on those kinds of abstractions.
Right.
Just a comment.
Yes?
One thing I was perhaps less in agreement with was your characterization of representation, and I don't think that your argument really hinges on it.
Okay.
But anyway, when you do a bit of programming, you realize that there's all kinds of representations. The space of possible representations is just enormous, and Frege representations are just a small set of them. As it turns out, programmers often don't use much of them. So the idea, for instance, that a thing can't represent itself, in computer science, that rule is violated. We can easily do that.
Okay. Could you say a little bit
Sure.
more?
You can have a data structure A equals A, so A is a representation of A. Multiple things could point to each other. You can have the set of all set contains itself. Perplexed Russell for some reason, but actually, when you're a programmer, it doesn't bother you that much. Sets can contain themselves, so this can contain themselves. The other thing is with respect to rules. You said that a representation requires a fixed set of rules. I think that often in a simple system or a computer program, that's probably the case. But if you think of modeling the human mind in development, or modeling a child who's learning how to manipulate objects, probably the rules according to which they manipulate their representations will change. And that's common. I mean, there's lots of examples of rule-based systems that will change, but they change in a more limited sense that you're adding rules. But you're thinking of something, the rules of the system changing. I would suspect that if you model child development, the rules will be changing, and moreover, at times the system's going to be in flux. Maybe it's asleep, maybe it's confused, maybe it's developing, and the rules will really be kind of unspecified. They're going to be changing, and how it turns out will depend on what happens in the rest of the architecture of the system. So I don't know if your characterization of representation is A, necessary for your argument, and B, claiming to.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that to the extent we bring representation into the argument, we don't cover all the ground. We don't even we don't claim to, but we certainly don't get close to covering all the ground that could be covered with respect to representation. Just a clarification, though, we don't say that representations necessarily are bound to fixed rules. And in fact, ordinary language is a very good example of how unfixed the rules are, in the sense that they're not necessary and sufficient. So what we're saying is that there has to be a convention of use with regard to a given concept. And that's what we mean by rules.
With regard to concept or representation? And I guess the question...
Well, I guess representation.
Okay, so the question arises that the system might be changing. When the system is changing, that's a special case between one and another. It's in flux, so in that case there is no set of rules. It's not just that it's of course development, but there's no rule at the moment.
I guess then I would just respond that sense of representation is fairly narrow. It's fairly constrained when you compare it against other kinds of representations and what we mean in ordinary language when we talk about a representation, something being a representation of something else. And typically we're not talking about, say, identity cases in mathematics, A equals A, that kind of thing. We're talking about truth standing in for relations. Yeah, I don't know if that addresses your issue, but I take your point, certainly, that there's a lot to say about representation, and we don't claim to say it all. Yeah. Yes. You've been so patient, Mark.
Okay, so I guess my point is related a bit to what Dawn said. The standard view, which I think you did a really nice job of characterizing, I could tell because I agreed with it all.
You could tell.
Allows you to do a lot of prediction, right? Like, so I can build a little model.
Yeah.
It takes a prototype view. I can teach it little things that I teach human subjects, and I can literally account for 95% of the variance in human responses, right? That's the good old-fashioned psychology.
Yeah.
I know what I can get when I think about it in this way.
Yeah.
You've proposed an alternative way of thinking about it, and I'm just wondering if you could just take a couple of extra minutes and say, okay, so what do we get from doing it that way, right?
Yeah, it's a good question. What do we get? I mean, I would say just in very general terms that to embark on any kind of scientific inquiry, to address an empirical question and to test an empirical proposition, that the constituent concepts have to be defined. Now, they don't always have to be defined technically, so they don't always have to be defined in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions, but they often do. And measurement's a really good case. So it can't maybe be a measure of something and then have claims be made on the basis of it. So conceptual analysis is important there because I think it sometimes illuminates where there is confusion with regard to the concepts that are at play in an empirical proposition. So that, just generally speaking. With regard to concepts, I don't have a prescription for what concept researchers should do, except maybe just stop and take some care to determine which of their questions are actually empirical questions, and whether or not the concepts have been suitably, I guess, analyzed in the sense of trying to identify problems and conceptual confusions that may exist, but also maybe to be careful about the kind of claims that are made with regard to the empirical results. And that was one point that's emphasized a little bit more in the paper, that often so-called, or claims about so-called epistemological dimensions of concepts are actually dressed up as ontological claims. And there, I think there are some potentially very misleading confusions that can result.
Can you give us an example of that?
It's hard not being a concept researcher for me to give you to pull a concrete example out of my head, but just even again in a really general sense, the question, what is a concept? It sounds like an empirical question, but it's not. It's actually a conceptual question, to the extent that there are. So it would be analogous to this kind of example, to take a look at our propositions and determine which of them are actually even empirical questions, whether or not they can be addressed empirically, because sometimes they can't. Yeah, sorry, I can't come up with a better one.
In general, what his questions are conceptual questions, and to a certain extent you have to take a pragmatic position.
Yeah.
And so I think, in answer to the previous question, the answer is really in your paper, but what do psychologists get? Well, you get coherence. You get to speak about language, about concepts in a way that's consistent with the way we talk about concepts in natural language, and I think that's pretty useful. So just another question. You said that you're thinking about concept possession as an activity, but I'm pretty sure you also believe it's you said it's an ability. So is it? Can we drop the activity requirement and say it really is a?
Yeah, I guess I would say concept use is a set of interrelated capacities. Yeah, ability talk gets it. I think it does kind of raise red flags for people, and I would be using it in a loose sense, but I take your point that there's a philosophy that comes with that kind of talk. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, the linguistic entities approach certainly make me think of the fact that children learning semantic categories before they learn to formalize the rules that express those categories.
Okay.
So that kids learn the concept plural before they learn the suffixation of S in English and so forth.
Okay. Yeah.
And I was, so I guess the evidence they have for this is that they, kids, so there's one thing is that in learning morphology, there's usually kind of like a default category.
Mm-hmm.
So kids learn singular before they learn plural.
Right.
And learn present tense before they learn past.
Right. Okay.
And they also sometimes in their productions they use expressions that imply they have the concept, but they haven't learned the formalization of the concept.
Okay.
So I guess I haven't fully mastered the linguistic construal approach that you're characterizing here, but is that position, are those facts kind of consistent with the idea that learning categories is learning to master the rules aside from that characterize them?
Yeah, I mean, it gets into sort of sticky thicket philosophically. What is going on versus, what they can express about what's going on. And so I'm not going to comment on that, but just from watching my own kids, I've thought about this a lot. Watching, they haven't figured out the conventions fully. But they can, say for example, they can discriminate between two things, but they can't express that discrimination because they don't know the rules of use for the linguistic conventions at play. And that's what I would say is kind of the rub there, right? We're not claiming, I'm certainly not claiming, that language, although I think the relationship can be, obviously bidirectional to some extent, but we're not claiming that language sort of settles what's going on for people. I think lots of things go on quite independently of language, but it's really about what can be expressed. And that's where development is so fascinating. To study the development of language is so fascinating, because that's where the really tricky questions really come up, often. Yeah.
I would just add one comment. There is a work of Anna Wyszwicka and Cliff Gordard on natural semantic meta-language.
Okay, yeah.
And so they postulated that there is a certain set of universal semantic primitives across different languages, and they do work on language acquisition. And so far they proved that those semantic primitives are acquired approximately at the same age.
Yeah.
By different language speakers.
Okay.
Different languages.
Yeah, and presumably on empirical grounds, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Sorry, yes, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think I'm disagreeing with the earlier speaker on the idea of computing and data structures. When they point to themselves, whether or not they're the concept of themselves. I think that's too extreme. In computing, you find concept in a couple places. Conceptual diagrams, that's what you started out like cloud diagrams in UML, which you go to a lot of work to put into any of these relationship attributes, which actually become data structures. So if your boss walks in and says, where are the concepts, you can point to a cloud diagram, and if he insists, where are the concepts, okay, they're between our ears, that's the only place they are, I'm sorry. The other place where concepts come up, of course, is in a way the opposite extreme. Neural networks, especially recurrent, multi-layered, where there is a nexus which always forms. You can run it many times, it might be here now and over there, but there's always this weighted association, maybe deep within, which always turns out to be necessary for the solution of the problem.
Okay.
If you forbade it from happening numerically, it wouldn't solve the problem anymore.
Okay.
So it's something that forms, it's from other things, and it's necessary. And the word concept informally can be associated with that formation.
Okay.
And then you explore expressing that in words so that you can share this with other people and not just the neural network. So that I like a little better. It comes back to whether a concept must be associated with language. Like when an idea, an epiphany occurs to you, you might be standing in front of the room, you're stopped by the light bulb coming on, and then you think, my gosh, how can I express this in words to share this with other people? You wouldn't argue that until you have the expression in words, it's not a concept, it's a something else.
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I mean, I think just in an ordinary sense, most of us are familiar with that. I can't put it into words. I have this idea, but I can't put it into words. I mean, I think it can be very difficult to express our feelings and experiences. But it's, in the context of this conversation, to call something like that a concept is kind of using concept in a fairly constrained way. And it wouldn't resonate, I think, so much with other uses of concept. That's about as far as I would get with that. With regard to your technical definitions of concept and the concept in computing, I think that's exactly what I went looking for in psychology. Show me the technical definition. I would like to see it, and then I'll know how it's different, how it's similar from the ordinary sense. And those are examples of quite different senses of that term certainly than we would use in much of psychology and in ordinary language. But you know, I understand what you're asking. I don't think I have a very adequate answer to that question. Can there be a concept that is, in a sense, expressionless? Yeah. Well, there are thoughts and ideas that are ineffable, for sure. I don't know that if I'd go as far as to say there's a linguistic concept that lacks expression, in the sense of having some kind of ontology independent of its expressions.
There's a name for that paradox. So, like, if you refer to it only as the linguistic concept that cannot be expressed, that's the linguistic expression of that concept.
Yeah. Right. Exactly.
Maybe we'll take one more question, and then if anybody else has further questions, Kate will be here for a minute or two.
Yeah.
So I need to ask about the concept of language and its ordinariness. The rat learns of contingencies when lights on press the lever get free. The experimenter has a concept of contingent. Does the rat, or is the behavior an analog of the language expression?
Yeah, I don't know, because we can't ask the rat. So I don't know. I mean, that's really my answer to the question, and I'm not being facetious.
So is the feature of language essential for your analysis? Or is it just regularity of behavior, sometimes expressed the way I'm speaking, but in other times, other ways?
Yeah, I would say no. Yeah, this analysis gets at a concept, a component of language, a linguistic entity, if you will. And I don't think it could be boiled down into a description of regularities.
When I saw your question, the title of your talk, I said, of course, I think it's worth asking the question. The answer is yes.
Yeah, and that's right.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for listening.